Okay, we're going to start a new chapter today, the lymphatic and immune system. And we'll see later on why we put those two together. So I'm going to do this one on the lymphatic system and then save it and then do the first video on the immune system. All right, as you can see, lymphatic system, we've already seen a little bit about this. In the first function you'll see on there, fluid recovery, because we learned in the last chapter, in the blood vessel chapter, that more fluid leaves capillaries by filtration than comes back through reabsorption. Only about 85% of the fluid that leaves a capillary comes back in to capillaries. 15% left over first becomes interstitial fluid, and then this interstitial fluid finds its way, as we'll see in a later slide, to a lymphatic capillary, and this interstitial fluid, once it enters a lymphatic capillary, will become lymph. Okay. Then immunity, and here's why the lymphatic system is so closely linked with the immune system, because this lymph will eventually percolate its way through lymphatic organs and lymphatic tissue, particularly lymph nodes. And in the lymph nodes, we're going to find lots of white blood cells, lymphocytes and macrophages and other white blood cells that will be fighting infection. Okay, and a third is lipid absorption. When you eat anything and you digest it, and we'll talk more about this in the digestive system, everything you eat, once it's digested, enters your blood in capillaries and goes straight, the capillaries form the hepatic portal vein and go straight to your liver, and you'll breaks up the more capillaries, and your liver decides what to do with those things. Everything you eat, except for fat. Fat is put into these special packages called lipoproteins, and it is put into the lymphatic system. And eventually it makes its way to the blood supply. As you'll see, the lymphatic system is eventually, the lymph is eventually returned to the blood in the subclavian veins. And so then that fat that you ate can make its way to adipocytes. So fat bypasses the liver. Okay. The nature of lymph. What is lymph? Well, it's interstitial fluid. It's the same exact thing as interstitial fluid, which is essentially blood plasma without the proteins. It's essentially a protein-free fluid. Right? Okay, so we're going to look at the overall lymphatic system and its anatomy, including the lymphatic vessels. So we're really looking at another circulatory system. The lymphatic system is another circulatory system. And it has lymphatic vessels. It has capillaries, has medium-sized ones, and so we go from small vessels, capillaries, to larger ones just called vessels. Larger ones then called trunks, and then the largest ones are called ducts, and they meet up with the cardiovascular system on the venous side, the subclavian veins. All right. Let's take a look at the entire lymphatic system. There it is. On the left is lymphatic vessels. On the right are lymphatic tissues and organs. And you have a capillary down lower left. You'll see a lymphatic capillary. These are blind-ended. And there are big spaces between the cells. And we're going to see them a little closer detail, I think, in the next slide. And then they become lymphatic vessels, lymphatic ducts, a large, almost like a sinus called the cisterna chyli, thoracic duct, right and left thoracic duct. Okay, then on the right, lymphatic tissues and organs, primary structures on the left of the right, the thymus, and the red bone marrow. Then there are secondary lymphatic structures, tonsils, lymph nodes, spleen, and what's called MALT, mucosal associated lymphatic tissue. A diverse, these are really diverse structures. And lymph nodes are found out through your entire body, but they're clustered in 3 areas. Cervical, axillary, which are armpits, and inguinal, your groin. All right. So here is a capillary bed, and we have regular blood capillaries, and interspersed between them are lymphatic capillaries. And on the right, you'll see the lymphatic capillaries. They're blind-ended, they're dead ends. And they have quite large openings between the cells that line so simple squamous epithelium, like blood capillaries, that line the lymphatic capillaries, and there's bigger spaces between them than you find in blood capillaries. That becomes later on when we get into lipid transport. And they're lower pressure than the interstitial fluid. And it would have to be because fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries. And as I said, once the interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries, now it's lymph. And it slowly flows, percolates down through the body. And it's a really low pressure system. Okay, so the flow of lymph. It drains throughout the entire body, this lymph, and slowly makes its way back to the subclavian veins. Lymphatic ducts is a violation of bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is if you split your body right down the middle here, left sides and right sides are like mirror images of each other. Okay? Same structures on both sides. When you get internally, there are some differences. Livers on the right, spleens on the left. So there's other violations, but as far as drainage, there's a real violation of bilateral symmetry in the lymph drainage, and I'm going to show you that on the next slide. Here is a look of the chest area. And we look at the very bottom, we have these right lumbar trunk and intestinal trunk, you don't have to know their names, that are leading into what's called the cisterna chyli, which is a big space, very large lymphatic vessel. And it's like a blood sinus in the sense that lots of trunks and lymphatic trunks lead to this big area. And then the lymph flows from that up the left lymphatic duct, which is called the thoracic duct. And as you see, this thoracic duct goes superiorly all the way around to the left subclavian vein, and that's where it drains back to the cardiovascular system. This cisterna chyli becomes really, really fatty. If you eat a meal that's got a lot of fat in it, you'll find it really is full of fat, because that's one of the things that lymph does, remember, is carries fat. Interesting thing, if you look at the right lymphatic duct, you find it's really short compared to the thoracic duct. And that's because of the uneven lymph drainage in the body. Lower right you will see that in light green is the area drained by the thoracic duct, and the darker green is the area drained by the right lymphatic duct. So essentially, just this and this is right lymphatic duct. The rest of the entire body is drained by the thoracic duct. So it's really uneven drainage. Okay. So primary lymphatic structures, red bone marrow and thymus. And these are formation and maturation of lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are really important white blood cells that are mostly found in lymph nodes. And there's two types, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And both of them are made in the red bone marrow, but T lymphocytes mature in the thymus. If you remember last semester in the endocrine system, we discussed the thymus and how it secretes these thymosins that allow T lymphocytes to mature. In fact, the T in T lymphocytes refers to the thymus. The B, interesting enough, the B in B lymphocytes refers to a bursa, an organ called a bursa, which we don't have. That's because most of the research done, the early research done on the immune system was done in chickens. And chickens have an organ called a bursa where B lymphocytes mature. But in human beings, they mature in the bone marrow, so you can think of B lymphocytes for human beings stands for bone marrow, the red bone marrow. All right. Secondary lymphatic structures. They house lymphocytes and other immune cells called dendritic cells, or called macrophages, which are large phagocytic cells. In fact, several of the white blood cells are phagocytic. That means they surround foreign bodies, organisms, surround them, bring them in, and chew them up. So we're going to look at some secondary lymphatic structures called, we talked about the lymphocytes in lymph nodes, lymph nodules, spleen, tonsils, appendix, and mold. So we can think about tonsils and appendix. The thought was that those were really useless structures. That we didn't really need them. And when I was a kid, if you got a sore throat, you went out and had your tonsils yanked out. It was like that. Sore throat, yank out tonsils. And so I'm lucky I still have mine. Now I find out that they're actually useful structures, and they don't do that anymore. Unless your child has like chronic sore throats and it comes back and back, they finally take out tonsils. But they are lymphatic organs. Same thing with the appendix, well, it was useless. The appendix is something in evolution called an exaptation. That is, it was at one time in our evolutionary history did one role. Now it does another role. It used to be a larger cecum, a large space for fermenting and breaking down really rough food that we used to eat. It's not needed anymore for that. It shrunk up, and now it contains lymphatic tissue, lots of white blood cells that do stuff. So it's actually a useful thing. You can live without it, but it is useful. Well, you can live without your spleen also, but I wouldn't want to do that because it's a pretty useful organ, even though you can live without it. Okay. And malt is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. These are like their border guards. They are going to be lining mucosa, like your GI tract, like your nasal passages, like a vagina, places where that your body's exposed to the outside, and it's a possible avenue for infection. So these are there, and hopefully the invaders will hit this thing first, and they'll take care of it before it goes any farther. Okay. So red bone marrow production of all formed elements, including B and T lymphocytes. And the thymus, and we'll talk about this again, there's a cortex and a medulla to the thymus. It's called a lymphoepithelial organ, T cell maturation, and it decreases in size throughout your entire life. And we're going to learn, like everything else declines as you get older and older. Your immune system declines also, and your thymus gets smaller and smaller as you grow older. Then lymph nodes. These are really important filtering of lymph, and we're going to find out that when you have bacteria or viruses entering your body, they often end up in lymph because they cause inflammation and they cause fluid to leave capillaries, and these things are flushed into lymphatic capillaries. And lymphatic capillaries, then the lymph slowly goes through the capillaries, and all the capillaries eventually turn into vessels. The vessels will enter lymph nodes, and the lymph will percolate through the lymph nodes, carrying these foreign organisms or foreign structures like viruses, and hopefully they will bump into B lymphocytes that have receptors for them, and B lymphocytes make antibodies. We've talked about antibodies and blood typing. Now we're going to look to see actually where they come from, how they work, how they're stimulated. So a stimulation of the immune system, stimulation of B lymphocytes, macrophages, and T lymphocytes by the presence of these foreign bodies. As I mentioned, the lymph nodes found throughout the body, but are also found in clusters, 3 clusters, cervical, axillary, and inguinal. And swollen glands, when you are fighting an infection, the more fluid enters these lymph nodes because you have inflammation someplace, and there's more interstitial fluid made, there's more lymph made, and it flows into and swells up the lymph nodes. So sometimes your physician will actually palpate these clustered areas of lymph nodes and see whether they can actually feel them. And if they're swollen, that's oftentimes an indication that you are fighting an infection. Here's a lymph node. And we have a cortex and a medulla to lymph nodes also. You can see several vessels that are entering the lymph nodes, and lymphatic vessels have valves in them, like veins. They're a very low pressure system. Things flow in one direction, and once they go through a valve, they can't backflow. And then as you see, the lymph will percolate down through the lymph node, and there's a bunch of white blood cells hanging around there, just waiting for some kind of foreign body to come by. And then there's one outflow efferent lymphatic vessel where this lymph will flow out of this lymph node and eventually finds a way to another lymph node. And that'll percolate to another lymph node, and then I'll leave that lymph node to another lymph node, to another lymph node, many lymph nodes along the way, until it eventually gets put into the thoracic duct or the left lymphatic, no, right lymphatic duct, and eventually ends up going back into the venous blood supply. So spleen, largest lymphatic organ, consists of red and white pulp, and it really has two jobs. One it filters both lymph and blood, and the white pulp is B and T lymphocytes and macrophages, very similar to a big lymph node. But it also has the red pulp, and these are composed of sinusoids, really leaky capillaries like a liver. And one of the main things about spleen, also that has in common with liver, is it detects old red blood cells, and it will take apart old red blood cells and recycle things, as we talked about in the blood chapter about the erythrocyte life cycle. When they're old, they're taken apart. The hemoglobin is taken apart, and we save those amino acids. The iron is put into a transport protein sent to the bone marrow, and the heme part of hemoglobin is broken down into the bile salts, bilirubin and biliverdin. And so the liver does that also. So, as I said, you can lose your spleen, and then the liver takes over that entire role. And oftentimes, if you get trauma, heavy trauma on your left side, you will rupture the spleen. And apparently, the capsule of the spleen is so thin it can't be repaired, so then you have to have a splenectomy. And so, like I said, you can't live without your spleen. So, functions. As I mentioned, phagocytosis of bacteria and other foreign substances, recycling of old RBCs, and oh yeah, a reservoir for platelets. So that platelets held reserved there. So if a platelet count gets a little low, we can open up the spleen and allow some more platelets to enter the blood. Then there's the nodules and mold. So in tonsils and appendix, they're really lymph nodules. They're like lymph nodes in a way, but they're not as well formed. It's diffuse lymphatic tissue. And some are we call Peyer's patches and mold. You can think of appendix and tonsils as nodules, but also as mold, and things called Peyer's patches that are like lining the entire GI tract, and they are mold, mucosal associated lymphatic tissue, and they're like little nodules, and they are like I said, the border guards to help be the first guys on the borderline between the outside and the inside, and hopefully they can be the first ones to attack these invaders. Okay, and so here's the infectious agents. Now we'll start talking about the immune system. So I'm going to stop this video and then save it on YouTube, and then we'll start on the first immune system video. Okay, so I'll see you later. Once I stop.